unstoppable killer. The so-called slasher has been stabbing, cutting, and well, slashing for years. The slasher subgenre has given us plenty of iconic killers, with Michael Myers reigning king of them all. With the genre being around as long as it has and influencing more and more in the horror genre, its origins have slowly faded into obscurity. We commonly call Halloween the first true slasher flick, and while yes, without Halloween we most likely wouldn't have gotten Friday the 13th, Scream, Nightmare on Elm Street, and a million others. The slasher genre's origins go back farther than we could have ever anticipated. Before we jump into the timeline and define the first real slasher movie, I'd like to break down and explain what makes a slasher movie stand out from other horror subgenres. According to the film historian Wickham Clayton, slasher movies are defined as a genre of horror films involving a killer stalking and murdering a group of people. This broad definition really opens up a lot of horror or even some action movies to be dubbed as a slasher. The common theme between most iconic slashers is a mask and a bladed weapon, but the overall definition grants movies like Alien and The Predator the title of slasher, as these films perfectly fit the definition. Famous slasher movies are also known for plenty of tropes. The bladed weapon, the masked and usually silent killer, the killer having some sort of supernatural power not allowing them to die, and of course, the final survivor, which usually happens to be a more naive and pure of heart female character, now famously called final girls. It's important to note that these tropes are not everything, but they still mean something, and a slasher film will typically have at least a few of them. As a result, we will use Clayton's definition and these tropes throughout the video to get closer to the first slasher put to film. With all these explanations out of the way, let's take a journey through the history of horror. It's time to find the first slasher film. As mentioned previously and all across popular culture, the first slasher we all think of is Michael Myers, first appearing in the 1978 film Halloween. It wasn't the first horror film to feature a masked killer, it wasn't the first to feature a deranged murderer, and it wasn't the first to feature a final girl, but I would say it was the first to streamline the slasher formula for a modern audience. The 1970s was amazing for horror and was the decade the genre truly became what we all think of it now. 70s horror was focused on possession and demons, psychological threats, and more terror than just a vampire or werewolf. While plenty of horror subgenres were being invented at the time, the slasher genre was being reinvented with a modern lens, Halloween being the catalyst. Halloween was a massive success and showed how easy it was to make something effectively terrifying on a shoestring budget. There is something close to Halloween that shares a lot of its similarities and came out only 4 years before. In the backwoods of the Texan desert, there is nothing that can save you. Texas Chainsaw Massacre released in 1974. It is commonly referred to as a slasher movie, but in reality it is and it isn't. With typical slasher movies, the killer seeks out their victims, but with Texas Chainsaw, the victims fall right into the hands of their killer, the skin-wearing psycho Leatherface. This aspect definitely complicates things. It is the main reason for why there's a debate here on whether this film really is a slasher or not, because Leatherface does not actually seek out any victims on his own. However, slasher tropes are still found throughout, most notably with the film ending with a final girl, and the rest of her teenage friends being slashed by Leatherface. Overall, I can't really figure out if this film should be classified as a true slasher or not. In whatever case, I felt it deserved a mention. There were still many that came before it, so let's continue the dive. For this next entry, before we get into the movie itself, we have to briefly discuss an entire Italian film movement that took place throughout the 1960s and all the way till this movie here, which was released in 1973. This movement was known as the giallo subgenre. The most basic definition I can find for the giallo subgenre is a stylish and violent crime thriller hailing from Italy. As you can see, this in some ways already may not sound too crazy far off from a slasher film, but some of them get even more similar, having multiple of the tropes we associate with slasher films. This all leads us to the film Torso from 1973, directed by Sergio Martino. This film follows a series of murders that occur on a college campus, where after that, a group of scantily clad women stay in a mansion until it all blows over. Of course, the killer is watching them, and one by one he brutally takes each of them out. So not only does this movie feature the trope of having this cast be all females, but it also has a masked killer, and a notable body count, and a final girl. It even features a slew of POV shots, which are also often associated with slasher films. In every single sense possible, this is a complete through-and-through slasher. It's remarkable to see how many of the tropes are completely present here, but there are actually a few more giallo films, even before this one, that may qualify. In 1971, Italian filmmaker Mario Bava laid the groundwork for the modern age of slashers with his film Reazione a Catena. The film goes by many names, Twitch of the Death Nerve, Bloodbath, and Carnage to name a few, but the main title used in the States is Bay of Blood. The film follows countless groups of people all vying for the estate of a recently murdered countess. The film is gory and brutal, but for a slasher it's missing some hallmarks. For one, there is no single masked killer, and well, more importantly, there's no single killer at all. The movie follows multiple people that attempt to kill each other. The genre is now known for its mainstay of a single killer, but this is a prototype for what's to come. This film set the groundwork for the brutal, bloody, and disgusting ways fictional killers would use to dispose their victims, its most important task. And the reason we had to list it is because it is confirmed to be a massive inspiration for a multitude of the most important slasher films of all time. It helped inspire Texas Chainsaw, which helped inspire Halloween, which helped bring the genre to what we know now. Most remarkable of all, it inspired Friday the 13th Part 2 so much that 2 of the film's kills are basically taken directly from it. While it may not really qualify as a slasher on its own, its influence was so large on actual slashers that we felt we still had to mention it. Of course, things do go back further. Going all the way back to the 1960s, we have 2 films that both released in the same year. In September of 1963, the film Dementia 13 would be released. Shockingly, this was actually the first major film made by Francis Ford Coppola. It revolves around a widow who wants her husband's inheritance, and she's being stalked by an axe-wielding fiend who takes people out one by one. This film certainly has some of the trademarks. As stated, there's an axe-wielding killer taking people out one by one, and the kills are also really gory. There is an aspect to this that may not work, and that's the fact that the movie is treated more of a mystery of figuring out who the killer really is. But then again, Scream does do the same thing. So all in all, I would honestly count this one as being a slasher. Of course, as we said though, there was another film released the same year. That other film is known as Blood Feast, directed by Herschel Gordon Lewis. This film introduces another subgenre that we'll briefly go over, this time being the splatter film. This one's explanation may seem obvious. It's defined as a subgenre of horror films that deliberately focuses on graphic portrayals of gore and graphic violence. Naturally, these films also sometimes have parallels with slasher films. Blood Feast is commonly considered to be the first of these, and it follows a chef who looks for and kills people with the intent of making the perfect meal to appease a god. The way in which people are killed definitely are like a slasher film. However, a lot of the film follows police rather than a group of people that get killed off. For these reasons, I don't think this one could fully qualify as a true slasher. Still though, 1963 was a massive year for horror that would inspire films for decades to come. This is still only the start of the modern era, and to get to the bottom of everything here, we might have to stop off at a seedy motel to find our answers. At the start of the new decade in 1963, Alfred Hitchcock released Psycho. The film's impact is still felt today, and it could be worth an entire video how this flick changed everything for horror and popular culture. But staying on topic, we will discuss its place and impact specifically on the subgenre of slashers, because this is another movie that is very often considered to be the first slasher ever made. The draw of Psycho at the time was how scary humans can be. In the 50s and before, monsters and aliens ruled the horror market. The start of the new decade called for the start of a new monster. The fear of Psycho is real. Norman Bates, for all intents and purposes, is real, and he's right behind you. Bates fits the slasher stereotype perfectly for a very early contender. He didn't need a mask or a gimmick, he's a trendsetter and is still as freaky as he was in 1960. There's a body count, and this movie was graphic in ways that, while they look tame now, weren't even allowed at the time. Most horrifying of all being this shot of a toilet. One thing that may work against this film though is the same thing that occurred with Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's the fact that everybody came to Bates, rather than him stalking and killing people himself. As iconic as this film is, it worked off the back of so many others, and still can't really be considered the first anything despite how important it is. This is where we started to get to some really old-fashioned horror, with the film 13 Women. The film released in 1932 and ironically only featured 11 women, with 3 actresses being cut out of the final film and one of the remaining actresses tasked to play dual roles. The flick follows the not-so-titular 11 women who are all sorority sisters. Each one writes to a clairvoyant and all receive their horoscope of doom. The clairvoyant is being manipulated by a woman who was kicked out of school and now wants revenge in the form of these 11 women offing themselves or pits them against each other. The slasher in question is Ursula Georgi. She's manipulative, conniving, and has a classic slasher trope of being kind of sympathetic. She's on a murderous rampage, but the school kicked her out for being mixed race and she wanted revenge on their backwards way of thought. Think Jason Voorhees drowning in the lake and now seeking revenge on the camp counselors. This is commonly considered the first ever slasher. Yet I may have found something that more commonly resembles the modern era of slasher flicks that happens to be 4 years older than 13 Women. In 1928, the first all-talking horror film, The Terror, was released. It already has the title of being the very first all-talking horror movie, and personally, I believe it also deserves the title of first slasher ever. The film revolves around guests staying at an inn who are all stalked and murdered by the titular Terror. The issue is, like with a lot of older films, The Terror is completely lost to time. It's difficult to give this film its due time since it's lost. We only have a short plot synopsis and some images to go off of. But from what we can see, it really seemed to have lined up in a lot of ways with the definition. Going back 50 years from Halloween, we just might have found the one. Of course, even before this movie came out, there were other films that shared some of the iconic slasher tropes. In the movie The Bat from 1926, guests in a mansion are taken out by a killer in a mask. This perfectly fits, except for the fact that a lot of this movie is treated as a comedy. One of the channel's all-time favorite movies is The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. This film is influential in so many ways, it's hard to even count them all. But it does actually have a killer and a body count. But the killings and the overall feel of the movie definitely aren't too similar to a slasher either. At the birth of film over 100 years ago, certain seeds were always being planted. At the end of all this, the further back we go, of course, the tropes start to lessen. We love final girls, masked, sometimes supernatural killers, and are left with the bare-bones template of killer stalks and kills people. All in all, this dive was extremely fun to explore. It gave us a perspective on the subgenre and horror as a whole that I never really had before. As much of a cop-out as this is, I do think the first slasher is up for interpretation. Is Halloween the first because it sets the stage for films that still release this year? Was it Torso for doing all these exact things a few years earlier? Or is it The Terror? Or is it something even older that subtly influenced the genre over an almost 100-year span? Horror, by its very nature, is a scary thing, but there's something beautiful to see how it evolved and became what it was over an entire century. It's always fascinating to dig into the roots of something so large, but it's even sweeter to do that and then find an even greater appreciation for something you've always loved. Whatever the case may be, we hope you enjoyed another one of our first blank videos. If you enjoyed this one, make sure to check out our video about the first meme, or if music is your thing, we also have a video deep diving into the first ever Vaporwave song/album. Of course, thank you guys so much for watching. I am sick, so if I sound a little weird, that is why, but make sure to like this video and subscribe. If you like the channel, make sure to check out our social medias, all in the description below. Make sure to stop by our Discord, it really is the best place to chat with us and hang with fellow Debunk enthusiasts. Of course, if you'd like to support the channel a little bit more, head over to our Patreon Debunk Plus. With only $1 a month, you guys get access to videos early, script PDFs, whatever random stuff we decide to put up, and more. As always, my name is Sep from Debunk File. See you guys next time. Bye.